Published 1943 EDT, the 8th of September 2017. Updated 1943 EDT, the 8th of September 2017. This is a story of fathers. The father who was feckless, a drinker and an exile from family and homeland. Another father who became the only Scotsman to score in a World Cup semi-final. And another who found football as salvation during the Libyan revolution. All are called Brown, all are of the same lineage, and two found a place in the USA Hall of Fame. It forms a testimony to the enduring power of football, the strong ties of family, and how history can be told through sport, with cameo roles for the Depression, 2 World Wars, National Service, the Hall of Fame, Unrest and Revolution, and, almost inevitably, bus rides with Bertie Auld. It is best to start at the beginning. The first father, Jim, deserted his family in 1920, leaving them in Troon, while he made his way to New Jersey in the United States. His son and grandson were to play for that country. George Brown was inducted into the USA Hall of Fame for his soccer exploits. Jim Brown made his way to the USA in 1927 in search of this father. They were never fully reconciled, but Jim, who had never played organized football in Scotland, forged a career in the USA, playing with the Plainfield Soccer Club, the New Executive and the New York Giants, among others. He was a full internationalist with the USA and scored in the 6-1 defeat to Argentina in the semi-final of the 1930 World Cup. His son, George, followed his father into the USA colors, playing in a World Cup qualifier against Mexico in 1957. After starting alongside Dad in an amateur side, George is now 81 and can look back with considerable affection on a father who inspired and coached him, a football career that took him to the Pan Am Games and to Celtic Park, and a professional life in the oil industry that was successful and always had football as its companion and, on one occasion, savior. George Brown at the 2010 National Soccer Hall of Fame induction in New Jersey. The Browns, then, can form a story of football in the 20th century, particularly in the USA. It is exciting, almost exotic, and ranges from Troon to Tripoli. George tells it with a gusto and a mind by a gentle humility. This was a family who had to work for everything. George Brown regularly talks of luck, but any good fortune was the product of hard labor. This is obvious when he talks of his father Jim. He was an interesting fella. Fairly uneducated, perhaps to what would be called 5th or 6th grade now, but he was very intelligent and that could get him into a lot of trouble. Jim was a union man in his trade as a riveter in Scotland. Jim Brown scored in the 1930 World Cup semi-final, a 6-1 defeat from the States v Argentina. My memory of him was that he was a very genuine individual. He loved to teach kids. He had a very soft manner about him and he spoke in a very soft Scottish accent. There was a tragedy in the family when my older brother died, and that was part of the stimulus of us emigrating, the first time for me and the second time for him. In 1948, Jim had come back from his first stint in the USA in 1932. The ship that took him back from the New World was besieged by managers who traveled out from the harbor in tugs to secure the first chance to sign the forward. Manchester United won that race and Jim went on to play for a variety of clubs, including Tottenham and Clyde, before taking up his trade in a Troon shipyard during the Second World War. He led a strike over the inequality of wages before traveling back to the USA after the war. He had to essentially start from scratch, says his son. He was a chauffeur and gardener. He only learned to drive when he moved out to the States. With my mother, they worked as a couple in Greenwich, Connecticut, a very wealthy town. We were the underclass. He was always working below his intelligence level, but as soon as he could get enough money behind him, he started coaching. He did not get much additional money, but he got some status. He was also an entrepreneur. He revived the Connecticut State League. Frankly, he did that so I could play. So what was father like as a player when he was on the field? He was so smooth. He was languid in his style. He kind of loped. He was head and shoulders above everyone else on the field even then, he says. In his first spell in the USA, Jim graduated to the national team, with his father's citizenship smoothing the way. He played in the 1930 World Cup, scoring that historic goal. He said it was a very rough game. George recalls 87 years after that encounter in the Estadio Centenario in Montevideo, Uruguay, the fella he was up against spent half the match spitting at him and throwing dirt in his face. He realized it was life and death to the Argentinian players. Injuries scuppered USA's chances with no substitutes allowed then, and it was subsequently a knee problem that ended Jim's career, leading him to return to Troon and riveting. But the USA beckoned again, and so did football. There wasn't much soccer in the country at all, says George of the USA of the late 1940s. He was, in a sense, a missionary. He raised the game a lot. The father also influenced significantly the life of the son. In the States, we started to do things together, and that meant soccer. He and my mother went to every game one ever played, he says. His father's personality and character also impressed George. It may be a cliché, but I would regularly ask later in life, what would Dad do in these circumstances? Jim died, aged 85, in 1994. His son had become an executive in the oil business after graduating with a master's degree from Columbia University. After national service, football coaching had helped him fund university studies. I was very lucky. I was always lucky, says George of football and life. It added a dimension to my life, he adds, of football I found in Libya and throughout my career, Saudi Arabia, Egypt. Soccer was an international language. In one case, in particular in Libya during revolution under curfew, with guys shooting off weapons, brandishing old shotguns, we would only get out for an hour for shopping. He says of events in 1969 when Muammar Gaddafi seized power. Before the turmoil, George would come home after work, put on a pair of sneakers and go out the back in the sand lot and kick a ball about with the locals. He adds, when the revolution came we would get up in the morning and there would be a package of milk, bread, cheese, provisions of all kinds. 6 months later I found out from my houseboy that Tripoli had been assigned to individual militia. The militia leader in my area was a goalkeeper I played against. He issued a ruling nobody bother the Browns. After retiring, George owned and rented cabins in Nova Scotia, coaching local sides with great success. In 1999, the family moved to Oneonta, New York State, where George and his wife, Peggy, both became integral parts of the National Soccer Hall of Fame. That institution had become embroiled in claims of self-serving and was considered by many not fit for purpose. The Browns, and others, changed that perception. The Hall of Fame will reopen in a permanent home in Dallas next year. This is another sign that the game in the USA is growing, with George full of praise for administrators. It has built a good fan base, in some places a terrific fan base. In Seattle, they're playing in front of 70,000. Its roots are established, he says. But, he believes, the major problem for further growth is that the USA season is not synchronized with the rest of the world and that soccer is dwarfed by established sports such as NFL, baseball and basketball. He insists, though, there is a place for football in the land where he and his father found a home, carved a satisfying life and shared a passion. There is just time for him to tell a final story. I trained with Celtic in 1957 with Willie Fernie, Bobby Collins, and Bertie Auld just coming up. I used to ride the bus with Bertie. George returned to the USA to do his national service but remembers the Lisbon Lion fondly. Bertie was a character, he says. And so, indisputably, are the Browns.